Now, the topic of de-dollarization has been commonly discussed over the last 5 years. But where do countries stand in the currencies they trade with and, of course, the assets they hold as part of their foreign currency reserves? Now, 80 years after the Bretton Woods conference, CGTN's Ramanyang takes a look at the data.
Now, there are two ways of broadly thinking about the de-dollarization issue, especially in practice, since money can be defined in very broad terms as either a store of value or tool for transactions. It's always useful to ask in what form countries are actually holding their reserves and whether or not they accept substitutes to the US dollar in their transactions. So let's start with the first part of the problem, right? If there is a determined push to move away from the dollar, ideally you'd see that cropping up in data from central banks around the world. So let's look at what the data actually says. Between the first quarter of 2020 and the second quarter of 2024, there hasn't really been a gigantic shift, right, in US dollar holdings as part of central bank reserves at around 6.75 trillion US dollars. But what about the dollar's relative share compared to other currencies and assets like gold, you ask? Well, relatively speaking, that translates to around 61.8% of FX reserves in total in 2020. Remember, very early days of the pandemic, and that translates to 58.2% by the end of June this year. Comparatively, the euro share of reserve holdings fell by around 30 or so basis points, and the share of the Chinese yuan and the Japanese yen, they raised their shares by marginal levels, 13 and 10 basis points respectively. So not much movement in reserves, but what about the currencies that we actually trade in? Well, if you look at the data from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, or SWIFT, as you and I better know it as, by August this year, the US dollar is being used in 1 out of every 2 transactions around the world. And in fact, when you remove Eurozone economies from the sample, that number goes up all the way to 60%. Relatively speaking, though, this is an increase compared to 38.5% and 42.89% respectively in September 2020. So then, a desire to move away from the US dollar may have been expressed, but in practice, it's clear the countries are still using the US dollar more, in fact, not less. And it's worth remembering at this point, there's still no free trade agreement that covers all 10 members of BRICS Plus, in addition to capital controls and managed FX rates among some members. And that, some argue, could slow down ongoing efforts to expand trade links within the bloc. In fact, a working paper from the French Central Bank extended that argument and pointed out that BRICS Plus collectively, they account for about 25% of global exports, but just 15% of those exports are to other members of the bloc. And a lot of that trade is still being conducted in G7 currencies. Oil, gas, soybeans, for example, all still priced for the most part in the US dollar. That said, there's something interesting and some interesting symbolism, right, in that this year's BRICS Plus summit is taking place essentially roughly at the same time at the fall meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and 80 years after the Bretton Woods conference, so the current global financial architecture was set up. And at this year's summit, Russia will be proposing the establishment of two things you certainly should keep an eye on. The first of those is setting up a cross-border payments initiative. Ideally, that should link central banks and allow payments to be settled without having to round trip it, right, through a third currency like the dollar or the euro, for example. And the equally important one is the establishment of BRICS Clear, a settlement system that will allow trade in national securities. Now, how swiftly the bloc actually moves on these proposals, that is a key matter to observe.